All right. Now we're recording. So, as I said from the beginning, this class was kind of a beta version, and we're just trying to see what, I'm just trying to see how I can put these classes together, these courses together. And as I've said a couple times, I'm trying to put 15 weeks of material and 8 weeks. And even then, you go by the hourly, I'm trying to put 45 hours worth of material into 16 hours. So um, as I move forward, I do plan on having some more courses. As I move forward, we'll just get better at you know, uh, prioritizing the material. Some of the places I went into detail, maybe I didn't need to, but don't regret where we ended, or where we've come and where we'll end tonight. Um, so I think it's good. So we'll get started here. We'll go through tonight and we'll finish regardless of where we land. Well, I know where we're going to land because I've finished it, but we won't be able to discuss as many of these versions as I wanted to. But I'm going to give you the highlights of the one. So this is kind of where we left off last week. We left off with the Bishop's Bible, 1568, and we're talking about the Bishop's Bible as a response, or as a updated version, that included the bishops there. Thus the name or whatever. So it gave honor somewhat to the Geneva Bible, even though it wasn't respected and liked. It gave honor to it, and this was authorized and passed out to the congregation. So this is where we talked about this last week. I'm not going to go into detail, but I just want to kind of give us a reference point for where we're going tonight. So after the after the Bishop's Bible, we end up here, and this is the one that I meant to include last week, and I simply just didn't have the slide for it because this really is included with the Bishop's Bible, the Great Bible, those translations right there just before the King, what we call as the King James. But I just didn't include it last time. But it's an important one to include because the other ones are coming from the Church of England. Obviously, the English translation started in England, and like we said before last weekend, the week before even, you have the translations coming out at a time where they weren't, authorized by the church. The split from the Roman Catholic Church in England kind of paved the way for these English translations to be accepted. And like I said, we're talking about 1500, the 16th century here. Up until this time, you really don't have English translations. Last week, someone in the class texted me after class and said it's just so crazy and humbling to think about the fact that these English speakers and really any other language of Europe at the time had no Bible in their language. At the time, they're going to these churches and they're hearing a Bible read in a language they can't understand, and then they have to learn the principles in English from those who were in the clergy. So it's kind of humbling to think about that. But here we have the Douay-Rheims translation that comes out around the same time, 1582, and this is from the Roman Catholic Church, and so they're being pressured here to produce an English translation. I mean, the cat's out of the bag, right? We're 200 years removed from uh, uh, Wycliffe, Wycliffe's translation. Tyndale's come along, they've got multiple translations that they're using. And now in England, they have an authorized version from the Queen herself that's being passed out to all the churches of England. So the Roman Catholic Church felt pressure to produce a translation with notes. The Geneva Bible, remember that kind of was published with vast amounts of notes and became somewhat of a thing at its time to include these notes in the margin. So they felt pressured to do that. There's a person named William Allen. He's a Oxford Fellow in England. Now he's going to flee England. I can't remember the exact year he flees England, but it's shortly before 1568. It may have been a year or two beforehand. He flees England in response to Queen Elizabeth I, who is opening up the she's welcoming the Protestant, um, the Protestant church there, the Church of England. Queen Mary before her had kind of gone back to the Roman Catholic Church tradition. Elizabeth I goes back away from that, and you kind of have some Roman Catholics fleeing England to go and be able to practice how they want at that time. You have this going back and forth. We talked about that last week, but now he's going to establish a college at Douai, France. So we start to see where this name of this version comes from. He's going to establish this in uh, Douai, France in 1568. There's a lot of things going on at the time, and really William Allen thought that this whole Protestant thing, this whole Church of England thing, this and more specifically the Protestant thing, the Protestant Reformation. Um, Funny, we're here talking about the Reformation the day after Reformation Day, but um, he thinks that this whole Reformation is just kind of a fad that's going to pass. So he aligns himself. He's already part of the Roman Catholic Church, but he aligns himself politically to support this Spanish invasion that was going to happen in England through the Armada, and he kind of gets a lot of kickback from that. Because there's still Roman Catholics practicing in England, and they understand the turmoil that's going to come from that. So he ends up out of persecution. I say persecution out of the tension around the support for the Spanish invasion. He's going to have to go to Reims, France, and he's going to move his whole college there in 1578. And then later, when things settle down, die down because England kicks the Spanish Armada's hind end, he's going to move the college back to Douai in 1593. So there's this other guy. His name's Gregory Martin. He comes from St. John's. It's like St. John's College in Oxford, and he comes from England. He comes down here to join the university or William Allen's college while it's in Reims, France, and he's going to start translating from the Vulgate, and he's gonna do this work from the Vulgate to the English, just like translations before him, and they're going to publish this from the different places where this college, depending on where it's at. So in 1582, the New Testament is published from Reims, and in 1610, the Old Testament is published from Douai. And you're going to see this kind of go forward. We talked about this before, how these Christian churches, they're going to publish the New Testament first and go back and do the work for the Old Testament. And that's just that's going to go all the way up into the 20th century. I mean, up until less than 100 years ago, translators are still doing the work that way. Some of that has to do with early on the belief of the importance of the New Testament containing the gospel. I would say that the gospel, I just was talking last week at a Bible study, we're in Genesis with a bunch of my Baptist friends, and I was talking about this idea of the serpent's head being crushed, and we were kind of following that through Scripture. I said the sad thing is, what I always try to impress upon people when I can, regardless of your denominational background, is that the gospel message starts in Genesis. And so anyway, for me, I would say, but part of this translational difference in time also comes from the means at this time, and the length of the Old Testament versus the New Testament. So you have not a whole lot of people at this time that are able to work on these translations. I mean, Gregory Martin's doing it himself. He starts with the New Testament, goes back to the Old Testament. It takes much longer for his work in the Old Testament simply because of the volume. Later on, you come to the 20th century when you have this explosion of translations that we have today. You have like the New International Version, the NIV, has 110 translators. Over 100 translators are part of the Holman Christian Standard Version. So you kind of have this work being, doled out, and even then, it still takes a few years to do all the work, but it doesn't take, 20 years, 30 years to complete the translation. So that's kind of just a little side note on explanation of differences between what's translated first and why certain things get translated quicker. That all these things kind of play into it, especially the farther back we go. Um, Here is a note in the introduction to the Douay-Rheims to kind of give you a perspective of its translation and why it was started. To meet the Protestant challenge, I mean, right from the bat, that was their complete motivation, was to combat the Protestant challenge at that time. Priests must be ready to quote scripture in the vulgar tongue, since their adversaries, they saw the Protestants as adversaries, have every favorable passage at their fingers' ends. They must know the passages correctly used by Catholics in support of our faith, or impiously misused by heretics in opposition to the church's faith. So this one here is going to be filled with notes. When we look at the translation itself, the quality of its translation is far less than the other translations before it, and the translations it was kind of trying to combat. It is translated straight from the Vulgate and kind of in opposition to the Reformation as well. I mean, when we talk about the Reformation and this whole push for uh, the translations, we discussed several times that this was in the context of um, the explosion of the study of Greek culture and context and languages. And so they kind of saw this going back to the Greek text as an affront to the Roman Catholic Church. So it's translated from the Vulgate, and they even mention in the introduction that it is truer than the Vulgar Greek. Vulgar Greek. They saw that the authorization of the Vulgate in the church history and the church tradition outweighed the primacy of the Greek text, even though the Greek text they acknowledged as being the original. So they said that this it's, I mean, we can always find ourselves in certain mentalities, but sometimes it's just hard for me to understand some of these mentalities. But uh, one interesting note for their translation is they interspersed the apocryphal books amongst the Old Testament and New Testament. They did not separate them out in this one. Um, and this is interesting because um, of what we discussed about the acceptance of the apocryphal books, especially around this time. The Catholic Church, in response to the Reformation, makes a stance and says anyone that does not include the apocryphal texts amongst their canon is a heretic, and they were doing so, in my opinion, based on their theological biases. These apocryphal books are the only place where they can find certain theologies or proof texts for certain theologies that they held within their church at that day. So their translation is overwhelmingly interspersed with theological uh, phrases. Here's a couple of them here. So instead of "give us this day our daily bread," in the Lord's Prayer, it says, "Give us today our superstantial bread." This is in reference, obviously, to um, the idea, the theology that the bread taken at the Lord's Supper would actually and quite literally transform to the body of Christ. It's not in line with the translation at all, and it's clearly changed for that. Instead of the word repent, where repentance is discussed, many I don't know if it's every time, but most times they change that to do penance, obviously to coincide with their theology of penance at the time. There's 58 Latinisms that are amongst the translation. So what I mean by Latinisms, these Latin words aren't translated; they're carried over and pretty much transliterated into the English text. And there's a scholar, I can't remember who it was. I just remember this phrase being associated with this translation, where he said, "This is the translation that needs to be translated." These 58 Latinisms, I mean, they knew they were Latinisms in the translation. They included an appendix at the back of the translation that labeled these and explained them out so that the reader could know what they meant. Because if you read them at face value, unless you knew Latin, you had no idea what was going on. So This translation includes expansive Roman Catholic Church notes in the margins that rivals the Geneva Bible. I mean, they went way overboard with trying to include all these notes because they're trying to get the reader to see their side of the theological spectrum. And they're trying to combat this Protestant Reformation that's really getting out of hand for them. So, but that's the Douay-Rheims Bible in 1582. And from there, we will go to the authorized version of 1611. This is the cover here. And this is not like a reprint. This was the cover at the time. And this is the authorized version commonly known as the King James Version. That is not the name of it. It is the authorized version of 1611. So at the time of 1611, you have Queen Elizabeth I. We talked about her. You kind of have a lot of reforms are going on, both religiously and politically. You have the literal Reformation going on within the church, but you also have a lot of political. There's to use kind of our modern terminology in what we understand in American politics. You have kind of this liberal transition in the political sphere where there's a lot more freedoms, a lot less conservative, old world mentalities going on in England. They defeat the Spanish Armada at this time, and you see this rapid explosion of literacy. This is the time of Shakespeare. Edmund Spenser, great poet, Francis Bacon, popular names in English literary history. You have great theologians now that are writing these discourses that had no place for writing beforehand, really. You don't see, I mean, you see these powerhouse church fathers and you see these few people interspersed throughout the history of the church, these theologians who are writing some commentaries and writing some things about the Bible. But now in this time, I want to emphasize that this is where you kind of have this beginning of towards today, where you have a lot of theologians. There's the conversation that's going on in the religious atmosphere of the nation, and there's these writings in response to writings, and all this is happening because this literacy, this spike in literacy, because more people can read what they're saying. Without that, these theologians would get together and talk and debate. But with this spike in literacy, now you have a lot of writing going on. In 1604, you have the famous Hampton Court Conference. Now, this is, if you haven't heard of this before, I'll give you the answer to the test up front. This is the place where the King James Version, the authorized version, is decided to be written. But it's in 1604. It's right after Elizabeth I dies in 1603. King James the First, he was James the First in Scotland, James the Sixth, right? I think I should put that on here. James the Sixth in England. But King James the First, he was, I put since birth, generally speaking, but around the age of one. It really doesn't matter if it's birth or one, right? Because nobody can rule a kingdom from that young of an age. But he's been the official king of Scotland since he was a toddler. And Queen Elizabeth dies, and now he takes over as King of England. He's kind of got a dual role going on. But as he's making his way to England, he's coming to sit on the throne, basically. He's coming to take his position. He receives this millenary petition. It's called that because there's 1,000 signatures on there. And these 1,000 signatures are coming from the Puritans here, and they're basically laying out their disputes against the Church of England. Now, they weren't sure, or they weren't quite sure. They thought they had a possibility of getting King James on their side, but on the political sphere, the Puritans had kind of done him some disadvantages in the political sphere previously, so he's not sympathetic to the Puritans at all, and he really kind of dismisses this petition here. The two great things within their petition that they were most concerned with was the prayer book that was being used in the Church of England and the Great Bible. The Great Bible being, a translation before this. They had issues with some of the things, excuse me, some of the things there. So they're going to come together at the Hampton Court Conference, and they're going to discuss these issues with the Puritans. They're going to bring Puritans in and Anglicans, people of the Church of England. They're going to bring both sides in. They're going to have this discussion, and really nothing's achieved there when it comes to the relations between theological factions. But what is achieved now, that what is achieved by this and what it becomes famous for, is that Dr. John Reynolds proposes that there be a new translation done, mainly to update the English and to try to address some of these things that the Puritans are talking about. I mean, that's at the focus here. The whole point of this conference was to try to rectify the relations here. So, it's proposed to have this translation that would be unbiased or untheological, try to give no theological bias within the text, work towards a Bible that everyone in England can use. And so that's the basis. Richard Bancroft strongly opposes this. And there's a whole storyline, but with Reynolds and Bancroft, and that we can't get into, but you can look that up. I think it actually discusses in the textbook. If you read the book, I think it discusses that. So now King James is going to agree to this translation. And a lot of people don't realize King James was actually strong in biblical languages. He knew Hebrew and Greek. I should have put Aramaic on here as well, because he's very strong in these languages. He knows what he's talking about when it comes to translations. He understands the discussion that's going on about the Geneva Bible and the Great Bible and stuff like that. So he's going to, previous to this, I mean, he's translated the book of Psalms, and he's paraphrased the book of Revelation straight from the Greek text. So he's already done some work himself. I mentioned that here because a lot of people, I think, have this idea of King James as if he is just dictating this as King of England and has no religious background at all. He's just doing this as a political ploy or something like that. But he actually grew up in Scotland, studying the Bible, having formal education in all the languages, and he's well versed in this topic. He knows what he's talking about. So he is going to agree to this new translation. He responds also here at the Hampton Court to the Geneva Bible and his issues there. He has issues with a lot of the treatment of things. Now this is where your political leanings kind of come in with him and some of the translations that happen here. And I used the midwives. I put midwives out here just as a reminder to use as an example. When it came to the midwives in Egypt, and the decree goes out to kill all the babies or whatever, and the midwives basically usurped the authority. He said that they were righteous in their actions to preserve life, but not righteous in their actions to have contempt for their ruler. He saw that no one should have contempt for their rulers, and this is going to play into the translation as well. So what was discussed here was that at the court conference was that this translation would be produced by biblical scholars. Again, he knows the languages. He understands the importance of them. He wants real good scholars working on this. Once the translation's done, it would be revised by the bishops, and then it would be ratified by by the king himself. So there would be no marginal notes. So they're taking out any marginal notes. They're trying to give a unbiased theological translation, or with no theological leanings within the translation. There's always going to be that, right? But you can make a concerted effort to not do that. Not every translation does that. There's later translations that they make very clear that they have no agenda to be unbiased, that they are, including their political or their theological leanings in the text. But they sought unity with this translation, and that was the whole point of no marginal notes. They're coming off the heels of the Geneva Bible that polarized the Church of England, and they're gonna try to unify the nation under that. So when it comes to King James's reign, he has a poor reign. I mean, he coming off the heels of Elizabeth I, who kicked the tails of the Spanish Armada and had built up this great navy and this great fleet. He basically lets it all go to scrap. He doesn't do anything to keep up with the navy. He just, that's just one example of kind of his really not less than lackluster reign as a king in England. And so this translation here becomes his highlight of his reign. And outside of that, there really is nothing to be said about him as king of England. So when it comes to the translation, there's 54 men appointed as translators. So now you start to see, I mean, this was really kind of uh, monumental at the time to have this whole team of translators. And they understood this. I mean, there is a bias coming into this from all sides, right? And they're trying to meet in the middle. But King James understands this. The people in the committee understand that they've got to get more than one person, more than two people. They need a committee of translators here with some checks and balances. And that's kind of what goes on. You have 54 men appointed as translators. 44 of them are listed in the preface. You have amongst these people both Anglicans and Puritans. You have also some laymen, some laymen amongst them as well. So you kind of have this. It really is looking back and the tools they had to use. This translation is really phenomenal in its time. So they're going to break down these translators into 6 panels. 2 are going to be at Oxford, 2 at Cambridge, 2 at Westminster. So they kind of go into these places of study. They're breaking out and they're going to study together. You know, they have basically teams of I say panels is what they were called. They're basically teams of translators broken out into 3 different teams at these 3 locations. When you break the panels down here, you have 3 Old Testament panels, 1 apocryphal panel, and 2 New Testament. Again, that's like I was saying about when it comes to translating the Old Testament and New Testament. The Old Testament takes more work and more time based on just the volume itself. So you kind of see this laid out right here with the panels. They got 3 Old Testament, 2 New Testament, and of course the Apocrypha, which is not much, doesn't take very much to work on it. So the main endeavor here is, or I guess the main endeavors, the main point of the translation is to update the language. English is changing pretty swiftly at this time, going from Middle English to Modern English, and Modern English is swiftly changing. So they need to update the language and they need to unify the people. So that's their point. As it went through these committees, this is kind of the transition here. It went from translation. Each of these panels would work on the translation. It would go up to the clergy for review, and then it's steered through printing and making sure that it's maintained. So they worked on this translation with 7 principles in mind, and really this back here is kind of a principle that's not included in the 7, the updating the language and the unify the people, but they're going to use the Bishop's Bible as their basis. They're really just kind of updating the Bishop's Bible. I mean, when you understand that they're trying to update the English and unify the people, it doesn't take having to reinvent the wheel necessarily when they have the Bishop's Bible that was done just previously, right there in 1602, which was an update to the Great Bible. I mean, these are good translations for their time, but they do rely on the Hebrew and Greek manuscripts. I don't know if I ever discussed this when I use capital MSS, that's manuscripts plural. They do refer to Hebrew and Greek manuscripts to try to weed through some questions, right? And you've got these panels here. So you do have some significant changes that happen because you've got more people, more eyes. They're able to get in the weeds with some of these verses and passages and say, what can be determined can we see some corrections needed? So they're going to use multiple words for the same original word. So what I mean by that is if they come across a Greek word, this one Greek word may be able to be rendered multiple ways in the English. So if it could, they would use it multiple ways in English. It may be even in the same passage or the same paragraph, the same Greek word contextually being used the same way. They would mix up what English word they used. This would be used really for style This was later reversed. They're going to go back later to just using single English words, and then it's going to reverse again later on. Uh, the means or the reasons this gets reversed and passed around later on is different for here. Later, with textual criticism flourishing in the 20th century, they're going to realize that there's nuances within Hebrew and Greek words. They aren't so simple. Even today, a lot of people will try to say, well, the farther back you go, the simpler the language. And that's not necessarily the case, especially when you're talking about a language like Hebrew, especially the Old Testament. You're talking about a language covering in the biblical text of the Old Testament covering 1,500 years. So just look at how English has changed in 1,500 years, and you can imagine the nuances of change between the time that the first five books, the Torah, the Pentateuch, the first five books of the Bible were written, versus when your later books, Zechariah and those later last books of the Old Testament, the Hebrew language has changed drastically. So you have all these nuances. That's going to be the reason later on for going back to more multiple words. But here it's being used for stylistic purposes. Add English necessaries. Now that seems weird how I've written that out, but there were we know this in our Bibles. I'm sure everybody in class here, I know you all, I'm sure you've all had discussions about this many times. What I'm referring to is the italics in the King James or the New King James versions. The italics where words were added in to the text. And mostly at this time, later on, you're going to have words added in for that are not what we call English necessaries, like definite articles, like the, stuff like that. And there was this, what I call a false notion here, to have to separate that because they saw this need to highlight what was represented in the text in the original language. So they wanted to separate out what they couldn't see in the original language if there wasn't a the or an and or whatever. I say it's a false notion because we're dealing with translation, so there's really no need to separate that out. You're trying to get the message across and relay it as close to the text as you can in the new language. So there really wasn't a need for that mostly. Later translations, maybe we could say theologically, there's a need for that in certain chapters and verses. But on the basis of why they did it is why I say it was kind of a false notion. But names to be used as closely to common names. So when they're using names, they're translating names like Joseph, John, stuff like that. But there was no standard, and you start seeing where in the authorized version of 1611 in the New Testament, Joshua's name, the Old Testament Joshua, they call him Jesus a couple of times in the New Testament. So you don't have like a standard across the board, but they were trying to get as close, to modern names as possible. Ecclesiastical words are retained. So now they're going back to, because the Geneva Bible used congregation instead of church. Now they're returning back to congregation. They used washing instead of baptism because, the Geneva Bible saw these as, terms motivated by politics and both religious and worldly politics. So they're going to go back to these words, church and baptism, and a few other ones. Those are the main ones. Like we said, there's no marginal notes allowed with the authorized version, and they're going to use the same chapters and verses that Stephanus, we talked about him. Those chapter and verses are going to go forward from there, and they're using them here. They do, however, put headings, and we talked about those headings. I mean, headings were used way back, in the Vulgate. You're talking about, way back before this. So they're just using new headings for their current understanding of divisions of the text. So the main thing with this, it provided a clear, fluent English translation for the modern readers. However, for it to be something that's updating the modern translation, it took over 50 years to be accepted. Now, you can read some text, and I can't remember how your textbook for this course puts it, but you can read back and forth and how they view the acceptance, depending on what scholar you're talking to. They view the acceptance of the authorized version differently. In my opinion, it really just didn't take off for 50 years. You have the Geneva Bible was very, very popular, and it stands in the way of this authorized version becoming popular, and both on are not really, I can't say both on political and translational basis. It's really on a political basis. The common people love the Geneva Bible, and they saw this as like much like we would say today if the United States came out with an authorized version of the Bible from them. There's people would say absolutely not, you know. So it takes 50 years before this version is accepted. When we look at the text that's used, um, the manuscripts that they used were way weaker than we have today. They're using the Textus Receptus of Erasmus, and to kind of give you an idea of what that looks like, Erasmus used, and we don't know exactly. I mean, we talked about him. He had very little to work with, right? So we would estimate that maybe up to 25, definitely no more, maybe up to 25 manuscripts Erasmus used in compiling his Textus Receptus. Today we have 5,358 manuscripts that scholars use when they go in to do translational work on the New Testament for modern translations. So um, it's very weak compared to modern translations in that sense. Even in the Old Testament, they're using two Hebrew polyglots. We talked about the Complutensian. There was another lesser known one. I say two just to be honest to what they were using, but really they're using the Complutensian polyglot that we discussed in class. So they're using just those two texts when it comes to the Old Testament. They're not using, you know, the Masoretic text that, you know, they're not using what we have today by far. Today we have about 800 manuscripts, Hebrew manuscripts that we use in translational work today. So that kind of shows you a difference between what they had to use then for its purpose in its time. It was very, very good work, but uh, compared to today, it's just we have so much more at our fingertips today um, to work with. So there's going to be some early additions to this, and moving forward for most of what we'll discuss are all revisions to the King James or the authorized version of the Bible. But here are some. In 1629, there had to be major revisions, and this was just something that came about. Um, uh, didn't even have time to go into what scholars were being used here, but they saw the need for major revisions to the 1611 version. So, like what we have today, if you get the King James version, that's why some, you know, you talk to some people that are big into the King James version, they'll say, "Oh, but do you use the 1611?" Because most of what you're using today is stemming from these 1629 revisions. Um, I would respond and say, absolutely not. I would not use a 1611 because it had a great need for revisions 18 years later. But they're going to revise it here in 1629. Um, there's 22,000 copies that are required to go out when it's first printed, and you have all kinds of printer issues. And then they're going to need more and more, and so you have multiple printers printing this authorized version. And the printing presses at the time, I mean, this isn't like our Lexmark printers that print out these things, and you know, however that's done in our vast amount of publishing houses. You have printer issues because you have these text types going in. I mean, people are literally placing the letters in their place to get these prints out, and so you have tons of issues. Here's some ones moving forward. These are all, I just find it amusing. Maybe I shouldn't find it amusing. We're talking about the Word of God, but these are all versions of the authorized version that came later than 1611. So the first one that I like to talk about is called the Wicked Bible. In the Ten Commandments there in Exodus 20, they forgot to put. I mean, we're talking about human error because they're placing these letters and words in these text types. And so they forgot to put the word not when it came to the instruction against adultery. So there in Exodus 20, it says, "Thou shalt commit adultery." You had an instruction. God told you to go commit adultery. So it's referred to as the Wicked Bible. Obviously, that wasn't what it was named at the time. It was named the Authorized Version. And but in history and scholarship has named these under these titles. So next you have the Unrighteous Bible, 1 Corinthians 6:9. The unrighteous, not the righteous, but the unrighteous shall inherit the earth. You have the Scribes Bible in 1702 there in Psalm 119. Instead of, let's see, printers have persecuted me is what it said. And it becomes a joke because there were tons of printing errors in this version specifically. Now I can't, because I'm looking at printers, now I can't remember what the original text is, but the other word starts with a P. Anyway, printers have persecuted me. And the joke is printers have persecuted this version of the Authorized Version because of its vast amount of printing errors. Yeah, the Vinegar Bible. So Luke 20, we have the titles. This isn't in the text itself, but the title to Luke 20 is printed as the parable of the vinegar instead of the parable of the vineyard. So parable of the vinegar. You have the Murderer's Bible later on. Instead of saying, let the children first be filled, it says, let the children first be killed. And then you have the Steadfast Version. At the end of Galatians 49, they just added the words to remain. So therefore is nicknamed Steadfast Version. And this error finds its place in the next two versions in 1806 and 1819. So there's just an example of, the challenges. It's kind of comical to look back and see these things, but it's the challenges that were in place there at that time that we don't have to deal with today. We have the means, the technology to really not have these type of errors and to put out a good topic. So here is where I would love to have a discussion on the King James Version only debate that happens in America, but I don't have time for that. So I'm giving a couple of references. These are my two go-to books: the King James Version Debate by D.A. Carson and the King James Only Controversy by James White. Both of these, they're similar to the book you have for this course. I say similar in writing style where everybody can understand what they're talking about. It's not written in scholarly language. These aren't written in scholarly language, but and they're also similar length. So those two books right there, very good to understand from a good scholarly perspective, this debate about the King James Version. And what I didn't include with this, and I think I put it out early in the course, that I would encourage everybody to go read the introduction to the Authorized Version. It's the introduction to the reader from the translators, and it's very long. You can find it on YouTube where someone actually reads it in modern English, or our vernacular of English. That was technically modern English, but reads it in our vernacular, or you can go find it and read it yourself. But the translators themselves, when I had these discussions about King James only, the translators of the text of this version themselves, of the Authorized Version, said that they were doing this task. And we go back here to the original part back here, that it was being produced, to update the language anyway. Yeah, main endeavor was to update the language and unify the people. And they expressed this very much in the introduction to their translation to the version. But they really double down and talk about the need for a continuous updating of the text in the modern vernacular and wherever the Bible finds its place. They really call for this to be the first of many great translations. And so for people that say, this is the only authorized version, or this is the only version we should use, the translators themselves, that comprised of a very good swath of the theological leanings of that time said, no, absolutely not. This should not be the only, but the first. And many translations that the believers of the Bible have an obligation to continue forward with updating these translations as many times as it takes to update the language where the people that have it in their hands can understand it as best as possible. So that kind of sums up just really, I mean, these two books get into the details of why the text is not nearly as accurate as today, what mistakes were in the text themselves. I mean, we're talking about these major revisions of 1629. They get into all kinds of stuff in those books, but that's the real thing for me is go see what the translators themselves had to say. Did they see that as being the end all be all? And the answer is no. So we're going to fast forward a lot of time. I mean, everything you have between 1611 and here is really all of these revisions, or not revisions, reprintings and updated versions of the authorized version until we get to 1885 and we have the revised edition. Now, the revised edition here is the same. We're taking the authorized version and updating it, and that's what's going on here. The New Testament's printed in 1881, Old Testament 1885. Now you see a huge difference between here and going back to, for example, the Douay-Rheims translation, where it took him almost 30 years between the New Testament and Old Testament. With the King James or the authorized version, you have these panels of translators, and this idea moves forward from there in like kind. And so you have what used to take many, many years being done in short order. Let's see, what dictionary was available during the 17th century? Like English dictionary? Is that what you're talking about, Johnny? English dictionary? Yes. I'm not sure. That's a good question. I'm not sure what dictionary there was. I think, I don't know. I don't know. I don't even want to try to answer that question because I honestly don't know. I don't want to give a wrong answer. But when it comes to revised edition, Dr. Samuel Wilberforce, he was the Bishop of Winchester. He calls for this updated version, and he's doing exactly what the translators of the authorized version said. Hey, it's time. Here in 1870, we've come to a place where we need to update the language a little bit. So this committee is going to have 16 supervisors, over 54 translators. So you're going to have these 54 translators. Now you're starting to use translators from different countries. You're not expanding out a whole lot. You're really just still in Europe, but you do have two committees in the United States. So they were trying to, at this point, this is the late 19th century. The United States is well established. You have schools over here. You have Bible schools over here. So they bring in two committees for the United States because this is an English-speaking country, right? We came from England, and the whole purpose here is English versions of the Bible. So they established two committees in the United States, one for the Old Testament, one for the New Testament. There's some issues there. They end up not being happy because a lot of the stuff that they wanted to see updated, and we can really, we can really even understand this today. There's a huge difference between our English and British English. In 1885, that was, or 1870, that was even the case then. So they wanted to see more of the language updated. I put Holy Ghost here as one of their main contentions. A lot of it had to do with just these idiosyncrasies within the English language between your different regions, but some of it had to do with like really going back to what was really said in the text. The British translators maintained Holy Ghost, and the U.S. translator said, actually that it's not Holy Ghost. Spirit, as this word should be used, more renders the original meaning of the text, and so they weren't really happy with the way the English Bible, the Revised Edition, came out. But they work towards it. When they get done with this, when they get done with the Revised Edition, they're going to promise, these two committees in the United States, they promised within 14 years they would have a different version that would be more suitable to their understanding of the text and updating what they thought should be done. Now you're going to see some pretty significant changes here. They're still going to be going back to the authorized versions, tradition of translation, and everything here, but we're talking about a lot later. We have more Greek manuscripts. We have a greater trust for the Greek manuscripts, the Hebrew manuscripts. So you're going to see these alterations allowed here. This is kind of, the first policy. They allowed alterations due to more Greek manuscripts. They're going to make 6,000 changes within the authorized text for, based on the research with these Greek manuscripts. They're going to improve ambiguous statements. So something that wasn't quite clear, they and we can understand why they weren't quite clear previously. They may have been trying to play it safe with the resources they have. Here in 1870, they've got many more manuscripts, many more resources. So they're going to clarify some of these ambiguous statements. They're going to make some corrections to obvious errors. That's always a given with all new translations. But now here's where you see this going back. So where there's more than one English word used for a Greek word, this is mostly in the New Testament. They don't really do it in the Hebrew necessarily as much, but they're going to go back to one word being used across the board for every, certain Greek word is used. They're going to translate it the same across the board every time. So, and then they're going to make some changes where parallel passages were not consistent. There's a few of those in the King James Version that, like parallel passages don't render the same meaning or something like that. So as they work through this translation, the translators would work through the text twice, and then they had to have a 2/3 ratification or a 2/3 vote to make these changes. So it wasn't just like one of these translators making a change and a supervisor approving it. For changes to the text, they had to have a 2/3 vote on allowing this change. So when it came to the translation, it was very restricted in changing the language. It's going to hold some of these old English words that have really lost meaning in the English of its time, and that was the U.S. committees. That was their main contention. And then there's some criticisms here with some of the things they did. This is just some examples from the Lord's Prayer. So it says, "Bring us not into temptation," and some saw that in the way they rendered that in the English as being counter to James 1:13, where it says God would not ever tempt us. And then the text ends the Lord's Prayer at the evil one instead of carrying on, "For thine is the," I have to say it back from the beginning now, "For thine is the kingdom." I can't even say it just from after that, but it doesn't include that last little clause in the Lord's Prayer. And they cite that based on the fact that the Greek text they were using didn't have it. They're updating the oldest Greek text, not the Greek text they had, but they said the oldest Greek texts did not have that clause. They would suggest that was added later. What the authorized version was working with were much later manuscripts that had that clause in there. So they kind of take that clause out. They get criticized for that. You have a couple of guys here. Now, a lot of study can be done on Westcott and Hort and what they've done, but they're working on this translation, and at the same time, they're working on a new Greek text. Remember, the authorized version is coming from Erasmus and his Textus Receptus. He's using no more than 25 Greek manuscripts. We have way more Greek manuscripts at this time. So Westcott and Hort, they're working on the translation, but at the same time, they're working on a new Greek critical text. And they're going to release this Greek critical text 5 days prior to the printing of the revised edition. Now, they're not like hoarding this up, right? They're sharing with all of the translators their research that they're doing at the same time. And this is influencing a lot of these changes. When I talked about 6,000 changes to the text, it's influencing this. So This translation's the first real use of modern textual criticism that we know today. So um, again, we go back to the text I received last week. How humbling it is that it took them so long to get a version in their language that they could understand. And now, as someone who works with translations and translating text and using critical apparatus and stuff that we have today, and um, to think that it's not even been well, it's less than 150 years ago when the first translation used these techniques of really trying to piece together, um, you know, textual criticism. What does the Septuagint say here in the Old Testament? What does the Dead Sea Scrolls say in comparison to the Septuagint? How can we piece those together and really try to find the best, what we think was the true intent of the text? That's not being done until this version right here. So, um, but God's word prevailed all the way through that time, and we're just blessed today to live at a time where we have these things at our fingertips. So, um, the Apocrypha. Now, when we talk about the authorized version and all of its editions, they include the Apocrypha completely separate. Um, or some of them do. Not all of them include the Apocrypha, but some of them include the Apocrypha. All of them separate, not considered canonical, but they're including them for historical purposes. We've been through that. But here you start to really see they're just keeping these texts in here for tradition's sake. One scholar, noted that the Apocrypha in the Revised Edition is the work of tired men. They're not really putting any effort. They're just kind of pushing it down the road. They're kicking the can, and after this, they're really going to kick the can off into the ditch and keep moving along without it. So, um, when it came to the Old Testament, they had a very literal translation of the Masoretic text. They're trying to stay as close as possible, but they did often clarify passages that previously were not clarified. So, and then they had poetic passages printed as poetry. And what I mean by that, prior to this, they didn't have necessarily, think about how your Psalms look different in the text versus the prose, or think about how you go through Deuteronomy and you get to the Deuteronomy 32 and the song of God there, and how that's printed different in your Bible. That's what I mean by that. So they highlight poetic passages by putting them in a poetic style. This is really the first time that's being done like it is, like we understand it today. So this is a very popular edition at first, sold 3 million copies in the first year, sold 2 million copies really in the first day. 2 million copies of this sold in the first day. That's across England and the United States, basically. It was sold elsewhere over the first year in other English-speaking countries, but by and large, it's all these sales are in England and the United States. But the popularity didn't last. There was, they had, for the sake of being as critical, I mean, text criticism here kind of hinders its popularity because they're too literal in their renderings of the text. And when you become too literal, remember that word we talked about a few weeks ago, wooden? When a translation's too wooden, it's not very readable. And when it's not very readable, you don't really read it. We would say today, many people today look at the authorized version, the King James Version, as that being a little too wooden in the English, or a little too old world English. And a lot of people don't read it because of that. So that's kind of what happened here. It was too literal. It was unreadable for some in the English. Charles Spurgeon, everybody's heard his name before. Charles Spurgeon said this version was weak, strong in Greek, but weak in English. So they improved tons of stuff when it came to text criticism, especially in the Greek text, but weak in the English. It is 8:03, so we will come back at we'll just come back at 8:15, and we will wrap it up for the night. All right. I hope everybody got something to drink, something to eat, and we'll keep moving along to the last half portion of the class for this course. So we're taking forward from 1885, the revised edition. We're going to the American Standard Version of 1901. So this was an offshoot of the revised edition. This was the promised version of the American translators of the revised edition. So um, it was an offshoot of that. When we talk about the revised edition, um, even though there were differences there, it wasn't like they were you know. Uh, I was thinking about it on the break. I hope I didn't make it seem as if there was this great tension between translators. It was not. Um, the American translators simply disagreed, gave their suggestions, but the way the panels were and the 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 process of um, you know doing the corrections and editing, they just didn't take the Americans' notes, but they included the notes in the back in the appendix. So I added that note, to make sure that that was understood. Um, Now they're going to promise from here. We go back to this time, 1885, and they promised within 14 years. After 14 years, they would have an American version of this. Now, what's the problem with that? That 14 years is 1899, and this one comes out in 1901. Well, the British translators of the revised edition kind of understood the need for an American version based on these notes that came, and they actually published before in about 1900 because the Americans were taking their sweet time. Uh, they published their own American version, but that would not be the one that stands. But uh, they kept trucking along here in America to push forward with this version, even though it's a couple years late. And it's published by Thomas Nelson. I mean, this is a popular publisher we know today. Thomas Nelson still publishes tons of books, theological books and stuff. So, um, and the New American Standard would become very popular and stand the test of time. People still go back to, I say New American Standard, the American Standard. Some people still love to go back to this version. Um, but when we talk about the translations, here's some of the stuff that I was talking about that they just kind of disagree with. I talked about the Holy Spirit, Holy Ghost, but some of this stuff was like clear uh, things within the English language, differences between British and American English dialects. So, um, which was or which what, whist, all of these. The main things there is how to relay which or who or that. The American version is using who. I mean, we do this today in our English language. You shouldn't be using the word that. I say we do this in our English language. Most people don't do this in our English language, but proper writing and speaking, if we're talking about a person, we don't use that. We use who. We should use who. If we're talking about a thing, we would use that. And hang on, I'm trying to get there we go. So that's kind of a lot of the issues they had. They wanted to use Hades instead of hell, love instead of charity. I kind of agree with some of those. Frighten instead of fray. You have boil instead of seethe or sod. I mean, sod is an old English term that still finds its way at the turn of the 20th century into the revised edition. So those are some of the things that they're contesting about, having issues with. When we talk about the translation, the marginal readings are cut down by 80%. When we talk about differences, here's an example of what I was talking about with who or which or that, or, in the Lord's Prayer, our Father who art in heaven. That's what we say today. I don't know a single person that doesn't say our Father who art in heaven. But the Revised Edition has our Father which art in heaven. We would say, at least here in America. I don't know what they use in British English today, if they would say who or which, but at least at the time of the turn of the 20th century, there was a difference of use there. And, that's this version is what started our tradition in America with our Father who art in heaven. Um, one of the main differences here, you now have the codices of Sinaiticus and Alexandrinus. I really wanted to get more into detail of the history of the different codices that we have, but these are complete codices that were discovered. And, since then we've found more codices and older codices, but you're talking about these are texts of the Bible that were previously unknown to translators. So now you're starting to see this explosion of resources and text, and you're able to critically view the Bible more and more. So, for example, the Old Testament uses the Masoretic text, but then relies on the Septuagint and relies on more, where it needs clarification. You're starting to see more and more of this critical use of the languages. So, uh, even though they updated some of those words on the previous screen, they still have some archaic words. There's a whole list of them. I used several here. I don't even know what these words mean, to be completely honest. These are in the American Standard Version of 1901. Key note about this version: super, super literal. So this is why a lot of people go back. You kind of have some people that, I want the exact, most literal translation. Um, and so they'll go back. You talk about English translations, at least ones that we can understand today, and the English that's readable to us. This one here, if you want the most literal translation, as word for word as you can get, I think this is, I mean, there may be something else out there that's a little debatable, but this is pretty much it, the American Standard Version. And it's too literal for most. But that's its translation technique. And there was obviously greater reception in the United States for this than the Revised Edition. And so much that immediately upon its release, the Presbyterian Church replaces their accepted Bible, their commonly accepted Bible. They've been using the King James Version like in their services. They replace it with the American Standard Version. They do receive criticisms from the Episcopal and the Methodist churches. These are based on, theological leanings and stuff like that. That's where the criticisms come from. It's just kind of nuances within the text that disagree with certain theologies. Here's kind of a timeline of or what? No, hang on. Yeah, we're going forward here. The Revised Standard Edition. So, again, this is another revision to the Authorized Version. I mean, we're still talking about versions that are coming off the coattails of King James and his 54 scholars is right here. So, in 1928, the American Standard Version, the copyright was sold to the International Council of Religious Education. This was a council that really stemmed off of another, I should have put it in here, not that I don't think anybody really cares about the different councils, but this was a council that was comprised of 45 major denominations. The main council, or the main organization, and this International Council on Religious Education was an offshoot of that. But I mentioned this because now you have tons of denominations coming together saying, hey, we need to update this stuff here. Now, this is in 1928. The Great Depression happened. So guess what? There's no money for it. You don't really see anything happening with this because you got to pay these people. You got to pay all these scholars that are working on this stuff. You got to pay for the printing, all this stuff. So there's no work done until funds become available in 1937. So the goal was to revise the American Standard Version, but to honor Tyndale and his translation back then. So there's 32 well-known scholars, and through all of this stuff of the Great Depression, these guys work for free. Luther Weigel is the head of the committee that takes on the translation of the updating of this translation. He comes from Yale Divinity School. That's where he's working at the time, and he heads it up. Just two groups here. There's not, a whole lot of stuff going on like previous translation. Just two groups, one Old Testament, one Old New Testament. Like I said, we're here in the 20th century now, and or at least for me, I can't speak for people listening here tonight or who will watch the course later. I can't speak for you, but at least for me, when I think of Bible translations, all I know is, you know, a Bible gets translated, a new version comes out, and I go to the store and I buy this new version of the whole Bible. Well, less than 100 years ago, they were still being published separately and then printed as a whole later. So you have pretty much that going on here. They're printed separately, but then in 1952, they're published as a whole. And the publicity for this is huge. This is the first Bible where you really kind of have a publicity campaign going on. They're spending tons of marketing dollars to push this Bible, and that's really the first time you kind of see that. Now today, new versions come out. I remember when the Christian Standard Version came out, tons of publicity. I appreciate that version. That's kind of my new favorite version. The most recent one, the ESV 2020, lots of publicity for that. But this is kind of really the first one where you had this kind of marketing campaign based around it. Now you're going to see a lot of revisions here. We're going through the years here, and they're having these revisions. Just we'll talk through them, but they're not necessarily always a revision to the text. It's just or an updating of a text. It's an updating of the market. And so in 1952, it's published as a whole. 1957. Now this is coming from a Protestant Reformation type background, but in 1957 they include the Apocrypha to gain Catholic acceptance. They want the Catholics to accept their, again, huge publicity for this thing. They want to sell as many as possible. 1962, the Oxford Annotated Bible comes out. Now, the Oxford Annotated Bible is really kind of what we would refer to today as a study Bible. We have all these study Bibles. This is the Revised Standard Version with scholarly notes introducing the books and chapters and sections. Notably, there's two scholars on here, but Metzger, Charles Metzger, who is a very well-known scholar, he's working on this. He gets this put out. So Charles Metzger, that's not his first name. Anyway, Metzger works on that. 1965, they have to republish. So if you know anything about the difference between Protestant and Catholic Bibles, there's some differences. So they end up reprinting the New Testament, a Catholic New Testament on this with some slight changes. 1973, they're still making some changes for more acceptance. They put it out as the Common Bible. The Common Bible, again, is really still just the Revised Standard Version, but they're trying to make this thing ecumenical. They want a Bible that is palatable for both Catholics and Protestants, and can reach as far as the arm can carry it. That's still not quite ecumenical enough. So in 1977, Oxford reprints this Common Bible and makes it truly as ecumenical as possible. What they do is they just include, I think in 1973, if I remember correctly, 1973, they didn't include every apocryphal text. They left out maybe Maccabees or something like that. So Oxford reprints this in 1977 and includes every apocryphal book as opposed to some. 1960, here we go. Translation, they're modernizing the language. That's the main thing that they're doing within this. You're going from 1957 back from 1901. So 50 years of change of English in America. There's some changes. So they're modernizing the language. Their main thing that they wanted to do was retain the dignity of the language while updating. That was their main care and concern when they're talking to their translational teams. They're saying, we still must maintain retain the dignity of the language, but update it to where modern readers can easily let it flow. There's no longer a constraint to one English word per original. So we're just 1957 where we go back to this, we back off away from this single word in the English being used to translate Hebrew and Greek terms. By 1957, you have lots of work done and critical research of text and languages. And they definitely understand at this point the nuances of the nuances of language and the nuances of all these Hebrew words and Greek words. So here they're going to use, I didn't know how on my keyboard to do capital or lowercase capital letters, but um, they're going to use capital L and then small capital ORD in the place of Jehovah. Um, what they realized at this time was that I think this was the one. No, maybe it was the next one. I'll save that. But um, previous translations, a couple of previous translations had used this. The most notably the American Standard Version used Jehovah in there for the name of God. So with a J, Jehovah. Um, English, our Bible English, I put it in quotations there. What I mean for that, they're going to see some of these very literal translation of words. Remember, I said that American Standard Version is about the most literal you get, and every time they see, and this is going back more to the Hebrew than the Greek, but every time you see something in there like "and" that doesn't necessarily need "and," our English language, we almost call it a run-on sentence if we say "and" too many times, whereas Hebrew will say "and" over and over and over, and they call this Bible English, where they saw these what they thought were superfluous extra words put in the text that could be condensed or rephrased to be understood modernly. So they remove a lot of ands, and then they remove a lot of idioms. This is one like, and it came to pass. That's a Hebrew idiom, and keeping that in the language in English like that honors the text. Well, at that time in 1957, they didn't quite understand these type of things. Later on, there's going to be a lot of research done. Like these ands are going to get put back in the text. One of the things that's most notable for the ASV and the Authorized Version and some of these real literal texts is these ands actually have a purpose in Hebrew sometimes. Um, think about trying to think of usages in the Hebrew Bible where it uses and over, and what it's doing is it's getting the reader to speed up. If I say, this happened and 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 this happened in the text really fast like that, it's actually speeding up your reading of the text. This train of use of the word "and" adds to the reading of the text. What's going on in the text is something that's happening very quickly, and it wants the reader to understand and feel a little bit of that pressure, feel a little bit of the anxiety that's supposed to be in the text. Well, this gets lost right here. That's kind of, I've explained that a little more than I wanted to, but this gets lost right here in the Revised Standard Version. And of course, some of those Hebrew idioms as well. For this version, there's more emendations in the text than ever before. But for the Old Testament, they're going to use mostly the Masoretic text. They refer to other sources when they need to for clarification, but straight from the Masoretic text. The New Testament, which I like here, is now you start to see this transition to what we call the eclectic Greek text. Whereas used to they're using like the oldest manuscripts they can. Now we have tons and tons of manuscripts. You've got lots of scholars working on the Greek text, and they're putting all these manuscripts together and saying, what do we think was truly the common theme through all these manuscripts, where you see these little differences, and we discussed this. You have to go back early on in this class when we talked about Hebrew and Greek and the transmission of those texts. The differences in the text are not like huge differences, but when you're talking about little nuances in a sentence here and there, they compile all of these texts and they study them. This is where the apparatus comes into play. This is kind of what's being used here. Instead of going back to one single text or one single critical text that's very ancient, like Erasmus, the Textus Receptus, now they're using the eclectic Greek. And so this Revised Standard Version is kind of breaking from that tradition of Textus Receptus and starts to use modern scholarship in that. So this version right here is generally accepted in both, but it receives some criticism. So some would say that it denied the virgin birth. So it used young maiden for Isaiah 7:14 instead of virgin. We're talking about the Hebrew word Alma. I know that some of you in here and some of you that are listening, um, y'all are very well aware of this debate, but Isaiah 7:14, Alma, um, how is that? I mean, young maiden, to be honest, is quite literally the right translation here. So, but it gets criticized for not putting virgin there instead of young maiden, and as if it's a theological thing. John 3:16, it uses only son instead of only begotten son. Some people don't like that. I would say this is one of my, favorite topics, at least within the Greek language and the Greek New Testament, that both of these don't really hone in on exactly what it is. There are many other people, to include you and I, that are referred to as sons of the living God. So that he's not the only son, nor is he the only begotten son, but he is the only unique, set apart son. He is different from any other creation that God has. And I don't want to get theological here tonight, but that's today we have a much better understanding of this word. So neither one of those would be, in my opinion, where it needs to be. So it is the most popular English translation for decades to come. And when I say decades, it's up until the 21st century that this English translation remains the number one uh, in England, in the United States, in Canada, those three countries at least, number one best-selling translation. So go to 1971, New American Standard Bible, the NASB, very popular today. The Lockman Foundation in California, they took on this task. It's another revision of the American Standard Version of 1901. The main difference here is they're just taking some of these advances in textual criticism. 1971 is, I don't remember if that's the exact year, but it's very close to the year that the Biblia Hebraicus Stuttgartensia is being released, the fourth edition. I don't think that it was, maybe not, it's around this time, like 1971, I think maybe the exact year, but they're not going to use it in this translation if it's not published yet. But the scholarship is already there, right? The scholarship that's being updated within the critical apparatus of the text of the Old Testament is being done. You have the Nestle, or the Nestle, not Nestle. It's spelled like we would say Nestle, but it's the Nestle. The Nestle Greek text is being compiled again. This is a new eclectic text that's here. So you have this revision based on just an update of scholarship. You're going to have a little bit of updating of language, but not a whole lot. That's not really what's going on here. You're updating the scholarship. So that's what's happening here. So from 57 to 71, you don't see just huge changes in our dialect of English, but this is being done by 58 anonymous translators. So we don't know who they are. We just know that they come from a vast, difference of denominational backgrounds. They kind of prided themselves on that. It took 10 years to complete. That's why I say they're not using the most recent, or the BHS of the Hebrew text, but that scholarship, that study is going on at the same time. So that's making its way into the changes to this translation. They adhere as closely to the original languages. And that's kind of, what was going on then all the way to now. I mean, that's our endeavor. How can we get back to the original language? And if I could say what has transitioned from 1971 to now, we've got BHQ coming out, 20 volumes of a critical text. Now you're trying to get not just back close to the original languages, and we're talking about, what did the first Hebrew Bible text of each book say in its language. Now we're trying to get back even more so into the thought processes of the people that wrote it, even more so. So you have a lot of transition between then and now. Focus just on language. Now it's focusing more and more every year on how can I get myself into the mind of the translator, as opposed to just looking at a Hebrew word on a page and saying, what's the best way to render this in English? Now it's much, much farther than that. So, but we're here in 1971. They updated the English language a little bit, not huge, from 1957. They're updating the ASV again. They're coming off of it, but not so much from the previous one. It's seen as a new translation when comparing it to the ASV that they use as their foundational text. They made so many changes that they couldn't really call it the New American Standard Version. It's as if it's just updating the language. There were so many critical changes that it's definitely seen as a whole new translation, even though that was the basis for it. So they're using the Biblia Hebraica, number 3 at this time, for the Old Testament, the Hebrew text, and they are using. I don't know how I keep losing stuff here. There we go. And they're using the Nestle Greek text. So you're going to see Nestle. This is compiling these eclectic texts, making a critical text out of the Greek. You're going to see this change to Nestle Aland as they move forward, working. We're not getting into the details here, but that's all the same work of compiling this eclectic Greek text, taking all the manuscripts, just like they're doing with the Hebrew and the BHQ and BHS, taking all the Greek manuscripts and putting them together, rendering them as best as possible and how we think they were originally. This is the one, not the last translation. This is the translation where they've done tons of research in the Hebrew language. They've deduced that Jehovah is definitely not an accurate representation of the name of God. So they go to this word Lord. So the problem, or not a problem, but this affects other things than just his name, because you have all these titles that were previously in the American Standard Version, like Jehovah Jireh. And so they're going to translate these titles into English instead of leaving them like that, because of this research done on the rendering Jehovah. Use principles of the Geneva Bible and the Authorized Version. So there's still, this is still like the great grandchild of these texts that were going on in the 16th, 17th century England, right? They're still following the tradition of those. So this one is far superior to its predecessors in the use of manuscripts and other texts. This is the real first modern version that's really using all sources. When it comes to the Old Testament, you're talking Septuagint, Dead Sea Scrolls, Aramaic texts, the Targums. It's using all of these things. Anyway, as much as possible. I was trying to think of the other one, Samaritan Pentateuch. It's using all that stuff here, and so it's far superior than all that have come before it. The problem with this one is it shows a heavy theological bias, especially when it comes to New Testament text and some of the prophecies of the Old Testament. They're going to show some heavy theological bias. And they came out later when they get criticized for this. They said, look, we've made no claim to impartiality. We're not the Authorized Version. So it used the principles of the Authorized Version and its translational techniques and stuff like that, but it's definitely not impartial when it comes to rendering theological biases in the text. So I think premillennialism, that was one of the things that they got criticized for, that they showed a theological leaning towards premillennialism within the text. So the New King James Version. Now this is, I thought I had it handy. It's not right here in my office. I think it's in my truck, but this is what I use, and I always chuckle because people always ask me what version should I use, and I would tell them all kinds of versions. This is not one I would ever list, but this is the version I carry around with me every day. And it's one of those things that's more about nostalgia and tradition. It's a Bible I've had for years and years and years. It tore up. Half of the Old Testament came completely out. I had paid lots of money to have it recovered, rebound, and all that stuff. So that's the one I still use, but this is probably my least favorite. They basically, in a nutshell, they take all that's good, all the good stuff. So they say there's a need. Well, we'll get into it, and I'll tell you. There's a guy named Sam Moore in early 80s. He works for Thomas Nelson, this corporation, this publisher. And he says, you know what? Most Americans, excuse me, most Americans still prefer the King James Version. So we really should update the King James Version into modern English. Um, the problem with that is studies then and even studies now say a third of Americans prefer the King James Version. That's not anywhere close. He said, I think the words he said was a vast majority of Americans still prefer the King James Version. No, all what do you call it? Studies show that about a third of Americans then and even now prefer the King James Version, nowhere close to a vast majority. So he based his endeavors to this new King James Version. Now, there's one right before this. I don't mention it here, but there's a King James 2 version that comes out before this one. It's has no success. There's some issues with it, so but I didn't even go through it because of time. But um, he says that this is the fifth revision of the authorized version. Now, you all went through me with some revisions from back then, but he's going to say those revisions don't count. All of those erroneous revisions, none of those count. There's a lot of revisions in between those erroneous revisions. He say those don't count. Those are really just sporadic updates and stuff like that. He's not even going to include the ones that we've talked about tonight: the Revised Version, the American Standard Version, the Revised Standard Version. Um, the New American Standard Version. All of these are and then King James 2 version that I didn't really mention. All of these are updates. These are all updates to the authorized version. I mean, and he's not going to include any of those. But if he did, he'd have to say, this is the 27th revision of the authorized version, and who really wants to get behind that? So there's some weird stuff going on here. One of his other claims was that the entire text of the King James Version is included. Well, there's some issues there too. Mainly this big, huge portion of the authorized version that includes the Apocrypha that's nowhere to be found in the New King James. So um, there's some issues there. When it comes to the translation, did I just use? Yeah. There's 130 evangelical scholars working on this. In breaking with the tradition of the authorized version, again, you're going to see theological leanings in this text that really the translators sought to get away from. And that all 130 of these evangelical scholars are going to work separately. They're all going to work on their own, but you had 3 levels of editing going on. So the scholars would work on their portion, and they just divided the portions up. You would have, I don't know the exact divisions, but you could say out of 130, you probably had, 75 or 80 scholars working on the Old Testament and the rest of them on the New Testament. Each one of those scholars fell underneath an editor that would come in, and you are a supervisor. We'll call it a supervisor because your editor's up higher, but they had a supervisor. So the supervisor would view the text, send it back to them if there were any changes that need to be made. It would come back up to them, and then they would send it to the editors that would make final revisions and send it to print. So here in 1982, you now do have BHS, Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, the 4th Biblia Hebraica. It's being used here for the Old Testament. However, they're still using the Textus Receptus. They go back to the Textus Receptus for the New Testament because that's what the Authorized Version used. Doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to me. BHS is not what the Authorized Version used for the Old Testament text, but so the logic doesn't flow there for me. What they do here, they're trying to update the English of the King James Version, and they take out all the good stuff. And what I mean by that, the King James Version is really good in its beautiful display of the English language. And what gets lost from then till now, and we kind of talked about that with the ands and the Hebrew idioms and stuff like that. What gets lost is a bit of the dignity of the text, the royal nature of the text. The King James Version, in its kingly English, to us especially, retains how the true, at least especially in the Hebrew Bible, how the Hebrew in the Hebrew Bible has that same refined style, um, within the text. And so when you start trying to take that out and make it completely modern, you lose the beauty and the dignity of this royal text that's established in the Authorized Version, and you bring forward all the bad stuff of it. So it doesn't update any of the New Testament because it's using Textus Receptus, and it brings forward everything bad and leaves everything good. So that's why I say I'm not a big New King James Version fan, which is just funny because that's the exact version that I carry with me every single day, and I read out of every single day. So we got a few more minutes here. We're going to wrap up just right on time, really, because I have to kind of cut it short, but cover a couple of more of the most popular ones. The New International Version. You're going to have a 1978, the first one that comes out. You're going to have a revision in 2011. This comes about from dissatisfaction amongst evangelicals. So all these other texts that we're really talking about, all these other versions are stemming off of this authorized version. And so you kind of have your non-evangelicals. And so what I mean by that, the Church of England was really an offshoot of the Roman Catholic Church. They're very refined, not just in the text, but very refined people in their worship. And so you kind of get, and this is not a knock to any denomination, this is just known differences. You have this difference between Presbyterian and Methodist, and then you've got Baptist, and you start seeing some charismatics and stuff like that in this time frame. So there's clear differences, and the Authorized Version and all of its revisions kind of maintains this refined, polished display, and so they become dissatisfied in that and some of the translational issues. So in 1965, they formed this Committee on Bible Translations, where 15 scholars from different denominations, evangelical denominations, come together, and they decide to produce a new version that they think that they would be happy with. So they have 110 translators from many countries. I think every continent pretty much is represented here, and they come up with this translation. So it's wildly anticipated. And what I mean by that, they did pre-sales for this version, and I forgot what it was. It was in the millions of pre-sold Bibles for this. So when it comes to the translation of the text, they're using BHS. Now you're seeing, these versions come out. They're using the most up-to-date scholarship. The apparatus they're using is giving them access to all these ancient documents and ancient renditions, the Dead Sea Scrolls, stuff like that. The New Testament's going to use a combination, which I like. It's using a combination of Nestle Aland and United Bible Societies. That's just another compilation of the text there of the Greek. So they're going to use both of these. Now, as you go forward from here, you're going to see some later English translations. We're not going to get into it, but they'll start using one or the other, UBS or NA. And you start seeing words like, I think right now we're on NA 28. So what's that? If you come across that, NA 28, that means it's the 28th revision of the Nestle Aland text. And that's how much our scholarship is transgressing and the updating to the scholarship of the Greek text. As we know, BHQ, that's the 5th Hebrew text, but you're coming off of a well-established history of the Hebrew text that wasn't so established with the Greek text. So that's why you see more revisions here of the Greek text more modernly versus the Hebrew text. So there's 20 teams of translators here. They're going to have 110 translators, 20 teams of translators. They have some oversight there. So not included in the 110 are some supervisory roles, editorial roles, but most noticeably, they also have an English stylist that they've hired to come on board here and stylize the English to be most accepted, in 1978. Here, there's 5 levels of review that this thing goes through. They're very careful, and they pride themselves when this comes out on being like a middle ground for what we call formal equivalents or word for word and dynamic equivalents. So they are trying to be the middle ground as possible, but you're going to have issues just like every other one. So they remove, again, many of these Hebrew idioms based on trying to get modern English. That's the problem when we try to modernize the English so much. We run the risk of, removing Hebrew idioms. We end up like, if it makes sense, a lot of times they end up replacing Hebrew idioms, and in some places adding English idioms. To update some things, especially when you're not doing a formal equivalence of the text. So God's name is translated here, so Lord. They're not using the Jehovah or any other rendition of the sacred name. When I think about, I just said that about English idioms, there is I'm trying to remember the name of this translation, came out, and it's a horrible, horrible translation. And they were trying to make it in the English that Southerners, so you can kind of understand where I'm going here, where Southerners would understand. It's it's the Cotton Patch Bible. That's what it is. The Cotton Patch Bible. So they go so far. This is just a little offshoot. This has nothing to do with the NIV, but I was just reminded on my discussion about injecting English idioms over Hebrew or Greek idioms. But the Cotton Patch version goes so far to relate to its modern readers at the time that it was released that it actually uses the N word in its translation. I mean, it's horrible. And raked over the coals, never accepted as a biblical translation. But I think that the translator thought he was doing something good to emphasize in a certain text the disdain for or the hatred that certain people in the Bible had for other people. So he's using it in a way that the people he was writing it for could understand, but it just, no way, man, too far, So, but that's the Cotton Patch Bible. So I forgot about that one until just now. That's in the list of worst translations ever. But so this one, back to the NIV, removes Hebrew idioms here. What's neat about the NIV in 1978, it includes 3,500 footnotes. Now, many of us, and me included in my New King James Version that I use, many of us have tons of notes. We have study Bibles, but that hadn't always been the case. So now what the NIV has done, it's getting textual criticism to the reader somewhat. It's including all these notes. So now the things that translators use, these apparatuses that they use to help make changes, now they're including these in the text so people reading can understand. Now, the main thing that you come across, it's 9:00 now, guys. Feel free to drop off, but I've only got a couple more slides. The main thing that you come across here with this idea is what we've all, I'm sure, seen a little bit of, and that's these memes that get passed around social media where the NIV removes verses, whole verses out of the text. John 3:5 is one of them. And but what they don't understand, which nobody, or they don't want to understand, try to explain to them what's really going on in the NIV, and they will close their ears very fast. They don't want to understand. They just want to say something's wrong. The NIV is not removing verses from the Bible. There's, like I said, an update here to the Greek text. They're compiling the majority of all of these. They're taking all Greek manuscripts, putting them together and saying, was this verse truly in the original manuscripts? So take John 3:5. I don't know that off the top of my head, I've done my research on the verse before, but off the top of my head, I can't tell you the earliest manuscript that it's in, but it's very, very late. So you've got manuscripts from the 2nd century all the way up to like the 11th century or 10th century, 1,000 years worth of manuscripts that don't include that verse. And then all of a sudden you have some manuscripts very late that include the verse. So what's a translator to do? Are they to say, well, this manuscript that was very late. Now, mind you, these earlier translations, this authorized version, they're not working with 1,000 years of many Greek manuscripts. Remember that. They're working off of Erasmus's very limited access to Greek manuscripts, no more than 25, if that. And he's really working on one Hebrew manuscript, or not even a manuscript, it's a polyglot. So when we take that into consideration, what is a translator in 1978 supposed to do? When they look at the apparatus, they're looking at Nestle Aland, they're looking at United Bible Societies, and they're seeing the apparatus that shows this verse doesn't make an appearance on the world stage of manuscripts until 1,000 years later. What would we expect them to do? Include that verse because of tradition? Or do we expect them to try to honor what they think is the most honest rendition of the original text? So what do? They have 5 levels of review. Remember, this is being handled very carefully. I think a lot of people, and the NIV is not my favorite, don't get me wrong. The NIV is not my favorite, although I do respect it. But it gets a lot of flack based on these types of things from people that don't quite understand. So what do? They have 110 translators. They send these translations through 5 levels of editorial review that are dealing with these issues. And then they make these changes in their version of the translation. And then they put all these footnotes so that readers will understand why a verse was not put in there. They'll say, you'll see it in many of yours, and later translations, the New King James Version, mine, it has footnotes that say, this manuscripts, most manuscripts don't have this. So this affected many translations and the reprinting of many translations and how they go forward. So very important work here in the NIV to boldly say, here's the latest scholarship we have, and this is what it looks like. So skip forward a good bit to 2004, probably my favorite translation. I'm a little biased on this. My mentor, Dr. Rodney Cloud, as I talked about him earlier in the class, was a translator on the Holman Christian Standard Version. 2004. So in 1984, this translation started 20 years before that. Arthur Farstad was the editor of the King James Version, and he's going to start his own task of a new translational work. He's going to bring in some help here and there, but it's mostly his little baby for a long time. 1998, he gets with Lifeway. This is the same people that have like the Lifeway stores. We don't have one here anymore. I don't know if they're still, if they shut down everywhere, but he's going to approach Lifeway Christian Resources in 1998 about doing this project of this new translation. It was going to be a whole new translation, but he's not. Let me back up here. Editor of the modern printings of the King James Version. He's obviously not the editor of the King James Version, but he's an editor of the modern printings of this. So he gets approval from Lifeway. We're going to take on this project, and then he dies. He doesn't get to see the completion of this project, and someone else takes over and redirects. I mean, some of the stuff, like he was actually going to stick with the original, like he was going to go back to Textus Receptus, and he was going to go use the text that the authorized version used and try to do a work there. I personally like the way it went after that. Someone else took over and brings on 100 scholars from every region of the world again. And their main thing was to establish, they established the inerrancy of God within their translation policies. That if they saw some differences in the text that seemed to be some inconsistencies, that they would search out and study to see why there's an inconsistency or perceived inconsistency. They wanted to, again, have a very balanced approach between formal and dynamic equivalency. They refer to this as optimal equivalency. They still use this term to try to set themselves apart from other middle ground translations like the NIV. But because they were trying to be this middle ground, and established the inerrancy of God, they had exhaustive scrutiny for the original text. I've talked to Dr. Cloud about this. I mean, they poured over single words for dozens and dozens of hours, and trying to truly do. But I can't overstate it enough. They exhaustively scrutinize the text to try to come to what they think it is or what it should be. So, New Testament, they're using a combination again here. I think in 2004 it was like NA 26 or something like that, or NA 25. And UBS, by the way, United Biblical Society, they also have some numbers. They're updating their text. Their numbers are lower. They're a later Greek text rendition, so they're like on UBS 7 or something like that. Old Testament's using BHS in 2004, latest and greatest up to date Hebrew text. They kept the sacred name in place, so they represent God's name as Yod Hey Vav Hey in the text, but they don't do it across the board. This is something I've talked to Dr. Cloud about, and he didn't understand it. But you kind of have this. They never established exactly that it would be used every time the sacred name was in the text. So it's used many times, but not every time. In 2010, they update the Holman Christian Standard Version. That's an update to the HCSV. And they expand their use of Yod Hey Vav Hey for the sacred name, but they still don't use it every time. And 2017, they come out with a Christian Standard Bible. This is a revision of the Holman Christian Standard Bible. They, in this instance, go back to using Lord for the sacred name. So they kind of look, we can't get our act together, basically, to be completely honest. We can't get our act together on how we're going to use the sacred name. So we're going to take it out and just translate it completely every time. So here's some other notables, just worth noting. 1959, the Berkeley version came out. Now this is I really actually like this version. I have a copy of it. They're hard to find. There weren't a lot of prints. The copy I have is like falling apart. I'm really on the search to find some new ones. Me personally, like, I love translation. I recently started trying to find some of these little known translations in bookshops and stuff. I mean, I could easily go on the internet and just order some for whatever price, but I find it neat to go to some used bookstores and try to find some of these neat translations. But the Berkeley version was done by a great scholar. Now, he did all the work on the New Testament, and then he had a team that worked on the Old Testament of, it wasn't many, like 10 scholars worked on the Old Testament. There were some issues there, but they were really, this was kind of your predecessor to the NIV and the Holman Christian Standard Bible, where he's trying to be that middle ground here in 1959 to where he can try to put it in modern English, but still maintain this optimal equivalency, right? In 1959, he runs into some issues, but by and large, I really like the translation. It didn't kick off. Now, to be completely honest, I think it was by the name. So it's called the Berkeley version based on where he lived. He lived in Berkeley, California, but that was viewed as a super liberal. It's still super liberal today. And everybody associated it with like UC Berkeley or something, And so I think it didn't gain any popularity. They tried to rename it to the modern version, and it just never took off. But I just note that if you ever come across the Berkeley version or the modern, I think it's the modern version, pick those up. It's a neat little English version. 1966, I mentioned this one just because you would see this, the Jerusalem Bible. Oh, this would be a great Bible, especially for some people in this class and our theological corner of the world. Hebrew roots and understanding the Hebrew the Hebrew background and context and culture of the Bible and how it's written. The Jerusalem Bible. It's a Catholic Bible, written or translated in Jerusalem by the Catholic Church, but named the Jerusalem Bible based on where it was translated. I threw in some paraphrases here. I would have really liked to go into detail about these. Again, it's over time. It's 9:10. Living Bible, the Message. They get a bad rap, but they are what they are. They're paraphrases. They were never intended to be these great translations. And so people are like, I just want to throw the message in the trash. I hear that a lot. Do you know that the message, we're talking about Peterson here, Eugene Peterson, the message was translated as such because he wanted a Bible that his 9-year-old could read and understand. That's why it was created the way it was. He wanted something his 9-year-old could understand. Now, we criticize that as adults, but there's adults out there that have the learning capacity of his 9-year-old daughter at the time that truly benefit from versions like this. So I'll bring those up just to say keep paraphrases within their context. They don't claim to be Bible translations. They claim to be paraphrases. When we understand language, and we talked about this many times early in this class, the whole point of transmitting language throughout time, and it doesn't matter how Hebrew was exactly said or Greek was exactly said at a time where we can't possibly know. What's intended was that the message is relayed, that what's being said is the content. Can we relay the content in a way that gets the point that God intended across? So in that sense, the message actually does what was most important to the most ancient believers who couldn't have read the text to begin with. It gives the gospel message, the story of God and within his creation, to a people where they can understand it. So anyway, I used to be one of those guys that said, I want to throw the message in the trash. Oh, I just noticed the Living Bible was not published in the year 1071, but 1971. But I just want to bring that up just so that we can keep paraphrases where they belong and understand that they're actually relaying God's word in a manner that's very similar to the most ancient relaying of God's word, oral tradition. So 1989, you have the Revised English Bible. This is just updating the ESV. 1996, New Living Translation, another middle ground translation, kind of leans more towards, leans away from formal equivalence and more towards, establishing the thought for thought. And then this year, I have not had the time to go into the ESV of 2020, but this year published the English Standard Version, the 2020 update. Seen a couple of just few texts. The the main one that I noticed through just reading some comments online and stuff was that Junia in the New Testament is now back to being a woman in the ESV. So they took away her apostleship, but they gave her back her womanhood. So if you're not familiar with that, Junia was translated Junius in most translations, which is the masculine form of Junia. And that word, that name Junius, is found nowhere in antiquity. There's another way to render the masculine form of Junia. Anyway, that's really the only update that I've read about in the ESV. So I can't say much there. But with that, we are very late, but we wrapped it up. It's 15 minutes afterwards. Again, I think, for in my defense, I will defend myself a little bit. I originally went in and thought, well, I'm just taking 15 classes and I'm breaking them down into 8. It wasn't until later when I thought, no. That's 15 3-hour classes. It's 45 hours I'm trying to break down into 16 hours. And so I'll know that going forward when we do some more of these courses. So anybody have any questions or comment? Oh, here we go. Thank you for putting on this lecture. My chat box went away. So let me see. Johnny says, any thoughts about the Interlinear Hebrew Greek English Bible by Henderson Publishing and the Sefer by Sefer Publishing Group? I'll speak to the first one, the Interlinear Hebrew Greek English Bible. That's generally for base knowledge. I mean, if you're just looking at the Greek and English and the Greek and Hebrew texts alongside the English, that's cool. It's great for trying to learn those languages and stuff like that. I've got some stuff that I like a little bit better, but it doesn't put them all three, all of them together at one. Um, so, I mean, if you're not doing translational work yourself and you're just trying to understand the languages and where we get that English translation, that's a good publication. The Sefer, on the other hand, I don't want to come out too strong. I will just say that the Sefer is a work done by someone who has no training in languages. It's not a translation. It's someone who took the King James Version and changed some words and stuff like that. So I would not suggest the Sefer to anybody ever, not once. Um, there are so many. Actually, I have a friend who is um, on Facebook. Johnny, I know you're not on Facebook, but I have a friend who's putting together some stuff. Maybe I've got your email address. I will send you what he's done so far on showing why the Sefer should never be used for Bible. So, um, but that's my comments on that. Thank you for clarifying the course, or for doing the course. Yeah, Lawrence, appreciate your participation. I'm sorry that we're kind of getting through some kinks here before we move forward some more courses. Uh, but appreciate the participation from everybody. Really great course. So what I will do is I'm going to put a questionnaire on some format within the next week, and I'll post it in the group. It's just feedback. So part of doing this course was to get feedback on my presentation of information and that type of stuff, and how you would like to see a future course. So I'd really appreciate some genuinely honest feedback. If you're still here after 9 weeks, it can't be too bad, but I do want some honest criticism so that I can improve this as we go forward. Looking at another course in after the first of the year, another 8-week course. I'll be able to definitely use the time better, knowing how to prioritize better, and looking at maybe a course on biblical archaeology, and a little more of a history lesson along the lines of history of the Bible, and again have a text that'll be similar, textbook similar, but that's what I'm looking at. So I'd appreciate honest feedback on the questionnaire, so that I can improve as I move forward. So appreciate everybody, and we'll talk to everyone soon. Thanks.